and welcome to The Gorge, a video game discussion podcast. I am, as always, your one and only host, the Witch of Mirrors. My want is to share with you a story which resonates with me. My way is to reflect its beauty to you, like the sun's light reflecting from the moon. The story I'm here to share with you today is called Umineko no Naku Koro Ni. It's a visual novel. Its genre is a mystery. Mind the article. The story details the return of a prodigal son, Ushiromi a battler, to a family from which he has long been absent. The day of their reunion is the family's annual conference on Rokenjima Island. However, the shadow of a storm looms overhead. A splintered family, a tremendous fortune, and a witch's puzzle. When the seagulls cry, none will be left alive. Though I'd normally continue on to discuss the finer points of the game featured in today's episode, today, I refuse. Can't, in good conscience, tarnish the game's grandeur and mystique by dissecting it for you so cleanly. On today's episode of The Gorge, we're not going to be talking about Umineko whatsoever. I'm sorry for misleading you, it's not in my nature. But I do have an episode for you. Listen to it. The show will be worth your while. This, I guarantee. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Gorge. I am your host this time around, Saturn, and joining me this time around is everyone's favorite Ben, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, it's me. If you've listened to this podcast before, you've heard my voice because it's my podcast.
That's right. And we're doing this Gorge this week just because, not a roundup, not like a special game we played recently or anything, but I had this urge to talk specifically about the Phoenix Wright series because you and Sara did the Great Ace Attorney Gorge, last year, I believe. Mm-hmm. And even though you both played that game a while ago, we did that Gorge a while ago, and I played that game a while ago, even it's still a game that sticks in my craw. And this isn't necessarily like a Great Ace Attorney again, but I just I really appreciate the Phoenix Wright series, and I feel like it is a series that has not necessarily stuck through into modern times very well. And I say modern, like the not DS years.
It's the fact that our most recent hit in the game is actually an HD port of 3DS titles is
from 10 years ago.
It's a little disheartening. I'm not gonna say it's not disheartening. I had hoped that the success of Great Ace Attorney advanced ports would have led to more Ace Attorney content, but it hasn't happened yet.
Not yet, at least. But I mean, and part of why we both want this, right? Because we've both played. I mean, I haven't played every game. I never touched the last of the Apollo trilogy, as it were, with a 6. Mm-hmm. But I have, aside from that, played basically every Ace Attorney game, and there's just really not a ton like it.
So. The thing, and I've probably talked about this before, but not with you directly, but, Ace Attorney as a franchise is... all of the parts of it are in perfect balance as far as I'm concerned.
Right. I think it's like you get some of that. You get a lot of the strengths of the visual novel stuff. You get a lot of really wild mysteries and a lot of really colorful characters. And for as many different versions of that game that there are, with as many different stories that they tell, with as many different people writing them, a lot of the time, you still get this kind of what feels like an almost inexhaustible well of just like colorful mysteries, and it rules. There's not really a lot else that's doing that, I don't think.
Yeah, no, and people have like, it's like, oh, if you like Ace Attorney, then try this. Like they've like it was like for a while it was Danganronpa, and then the AI the Somnium Files, which I'm sure AI the Somnium Files is a good game, and I plan on playing it. I'm never gonna touch Danganronpa in my life.
Yeah, those games
Um,
are like they're both great. Like I don't like I still haven't played AI Somnium Files yet, but like it is by Kotaro Uchikoshi, who is like just a really incredible VN director in my opinion. I've played most
mhm.
of the stuff he's made. But they're also like completely very tonally different, right? Like
Yeah,
Danganronpa is just like a fucking bleak nightmare most of the time.
cynical, like it's a murder party, and it's like I don't like that genre in the first place,
Yeah, there's a lot
so
of
I'm not.
candy coated nihilism and shit like that going on,
Yeah.
right? It's kind of gross in its own way. And then like the Ushikoshi visual novels, like they're really good, but even like when Uchikoshi is writing a mystery novel, like most of his stuff still feels kind of more in the vein of something like Aegis Rim, right? Where it's like
Yeah.
he's principally like a guy who does like mysteries that have a lot of crazy sci-fi elements in them and
Right.
kind of like merging, like kind of walking the boundary between being a mystery novel and being an episode of Star Trek.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's like Ace Attorney just all I like Ace Attorney as the complete package. Like the mysteries are the perfect amount of like intriguing with the number of twists that go into them. The characters are fun and flamboyant and creative, and they all have like gimmicks and weird pun names. Um, the actual thinking part is complicated, and the puzzles are hard to work through, but they're very rewarding. And there's no game like it that I know of where you can win arguments you have in the shower.
Exactly. Honestly, it's like one of the only times I've ever been disappointed with like the Mysteries and Ace Attorney series is in Dual Destinies, the fifth one, where for like the first three cases, they're like at the beginning of the case, like, by the way, this is the killer. This that way when you run into the character, you know who killed the person immediately. This is them. Look at them. And
Right.
it's like, come on, ye of little faith. I've played I know this is like a new entry for 3DS or whatever, but it's like it's a mystery novel, right? You know, it's
Yeah.
a mystery game. But like the idea is like you're coming here to figure this out, right? And I don't need you to tell me. I'll get
The the
there.
the fun part of any like good Ace Attorney case is when you just sit there with the DS or 3DS in your hand and you go, "Wait,
Yeah.
wait."
Wait a minute. It was Polly Walnuts. I don't know.
It was it was you. But wait a minute, but you were over there at the time. So how did you get to here? Wait.
Um
And then you like dig deeper and you figure out some more shit and it's like, "Oh. Oh."
Yeah, and that's like kind of like the essence of like a really good mystery too, because it's like like the actual like non-interactive mystery novels, like all the Agatha Christie's and shit like that. Like
Mhm.
it's kind of built on that same premise, right? Of like here's a situation where you have this kind of, and especially in the case of Phoenix Wright, like to the extent like with Great Ace Attorney, where it actually makes a joke at its own expense about how often it's doing this, right? You have a closed room of some kind, maybe not literally a closed room, but you have a area that is cut off by circumstance, and you
Mhm.
have a limited number of people who could have been participants in the crime. And there's someone who it seems like it's very likely that it is, who in the case of Phoenix Wright is your defendant, and you have to go through all the evidence, all the reasoning, all the brain bending pretzel shit to figure out no wait, it was that guy and he had an insane plan that he somehow worked. uh I guess I should put a because this is like post Grace Attorney Gorge, I'll just put in a little like hey, I'm going to talk about like specific case details from
Right.
these games, right? So like if you don't want to hear any of those, like maybe skip ahead a little bit. But one of the ones in Great Ace Attorney is the murder that you principally solve by figuring out how they faked the teleportation device.
Yeah. Which is an insane case to work through, to puzzle out how it worked. It is a lot like if you cut out the first 20 minutes of any given Columbo episode and
Yeah.
started the episode right when Columbo wanders into the crime scene.
Yeah, except you also cut out that first 20 minutes of Columbo already developing a good idea of what's happening, and so your dude just ends up on the scene like, uh-oh, my client seems really guilty. In the case of the teleportation episode, you have this thing of like, and it's actually one of the more interesting things that episode does now that I think about it, and I think is really cool, is because like you come into this knowing that Phoenix Wright is, aside from the presence of like Shinto spirits,
Yeah,
basically a grounded franchise. It is
right.
basically adjacent to modern human history. And
Mhm.
you come into it kind of knowing from the player perspective, like, well, yeah, there's no way the teleportation machine actually worked. That would be insane.
But the
Uh,
crazy thing about that is that you're like, but ghosts do exist,
yeah,
and Van Zeeks seems incredibly determined to believe the teleportation happened, and he's not an idiot.
yeah, no, and that's
And you so
it's like
so
one of the
you're
few
like,
pieces. It's one of the few very good pieces of characterization you get from Van Zeeks in that game too. Is that his like willingness to believe in his friend, even at the expense of his friend's like character,
yeah.
supersedes any better instincts he might have.
So and you're mostly convinced that no, the teleportation didn't happen. There's a trick, but you're still like, but
Is it
what if?
possible?
But what if it did happen?
Yeah, and that's like it's a really fun tension, and that's actually one of the great things that Great Ace Attorney does too. That some of the other ones do as well, but it creates this situation where, especially for that case, the actual like ability for your defendant to be like actually held under suspicion is based on the idea this insane magic trick that he did actually worked, and
Yeah,
that the science worked how he thought it did and everything else, and you're kind of fighting against him because you need to prove it was fake so that no one actually thinks he did.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it's stuff like that. The Ace Attorney series is full of great moments like that.
Mhm.
I'm trying to think of what some of my other favorite stuff is in there. I really like I think my other favorite one, or like the other one that really sticks with me. I like every case, I like every game. There's great cases in every single game.
Yeah,
It's actually really difficult now. I'm sitting here thinking about it, like, oh, what's my favorite shit? I always think though about the last case in the third game in Trials and Tribulations,
yeah.
with that like insane like across the bridge thing where the body was swung on a rope or whatever. And it's like,
Mhm.
my God, we really had to work at this for like 20 hours to get to this point of just like, oh, so you can't actually explain it.
Yeah,
There is a way this happened, and it's not like completely insane.
that's the thing that it really appeals to me about this over like other mystery novels that get recommended to me. Like for a while, I played a lot of the Professor Layton games too,
Hmm.
because they also scratched that same puzzle itch when I ran out of Ace Attorney games. But the actual plots of each Professor Layton game are way too fantastical to scratch the same like, oh, I figured out what's going on itch that Phoenix Wright has, because the Professor Layton games are way more like children's book in their approach, and so they don't have to like actually think out their mystery. It can be like a crazy twist that you could literally never predict.
Well, if I remember correctly, too, Layton's also a game where the actual like the gameplay of the mystery aspects too is also kind of like a more childlike kind of thing too, right? Where like for Ace
Yeah.
Attorney, it's like you're presenting this narrative and you're kind of like very slowly picking it apart. But I know like Layton is, and this is why I've never actually played a Layton game myself, because I've been, had a friend share a couple of these puzzles with me. But you get these like brain bender, like little like one screen logic puzzles that like
Hmm.
you have to like spot the flaw in the wording or like do like complicated like logic circuit stuff, and I've always just been like, oh man, my brain's too cement for that. I can't do that. I'm
It's
sorry, Professor Layton. I've let you down.
Yeah, and it's not entirely fair to compare them because Professor Layton is a series about puzzles with a plot to give you more puzzles to do.
Exactly.
Like it's a book of puzzles, and there's a narrative byline to tie the puzzles together. But the majority of the game is wandering around, tapping on people, and having them solve a math problem for them.
It would be like if Picross or something, right, had like an epic RPG frame narrative,
Yeah.
but it was still just Picross.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not entirely fair to compare them, but like that's that's the comparison I go to when I think of like how Ace Attorney threads the needle perfectly of like, this is an insane convoluted plot that happened, but it's entirely believable by the end of it.
Yeah, there's like genuinely, aside from people having the names that they do, there aren't
Mhm.
a ton of stories in the, at least in the mainline Ace Attorney stuff. I've my memory on like the Edgeworth spinoffs is really foggy.
Yeah.
But there's not a ton of things that happen in there that are truly like beyond the pale of being a thing that could have happened. You
Yeah.
know?
A lot. I know some of the ones that like kind of stretch the limitations are like it's mostly just by like by sheer coincidence this thing happened at the same time.
Or it's like ghosts are real and they made
Yeah.
this happen.
And
This happened because of real ghosts, and we're going to
Yeah.
bring them into the stand now.
Like even the things that like kind of get like poked fun at, like when you bring a parrot to the witness stand, or you bring you have to defend a whale in the DLC case for Dual Destinies.
That's right.
It's
Oh, I
still
forgot
like
about that.
by the end of it, you're still like, oh yeah, the truth of this situation actually tracks, and I couldn't see it happening in the real world, but in the logic, like this doesn't break the established world logic of Ace Attorney.
Yeah, like, and I think like part of it is like even the most egregious things in there, like in the first game when you bring a parrot onto the stand, or is it the second game? It
It's
was
the
one of
first game.
those. Yeah, a second game had you bring a different animal onto the stand, I think. Um, but it's one of those things where it's like even when it stretches the bounds of credulity, there's also a degree like part of the thing with Ace Attorney, at least the original conceptualization of it, is that it's like it's about how fucked the Japanese legal system is. Where if you
Yeah.
get sent to court, you have basically like 99% odds of getting sent to jail or
Mhm.
being found guilty or whatever. And it's just like, oh yeah, of course they bring in a parrot to try and get your guy found guilty. That's crazy. Why not? Um,
Yeah.
but it's still like, even if you're willing to put that behind you and go like, well, okay, let's suspend disbelief a little bit and say we live in a world where they'll allow you to bring a parrot onto the witness stand. The events and like the way you unravel them and like the stuff you do for cross examinations and stuff, it all still feels believable. There's never anything that's like left to like divine providence or anything
Mhm.
like that. You know, you still have to do the work of sussing out what happened from the evidence and testimony that you have available to you.
Yeah, exactly. There was never a moment where I figured out the truth of the case and I was like, that's actually bullshit. Like there's no way that you could have actually planned that out. Like everything that happens like does track.
Yeah, it's I love Ace Attorney, man.
Ace
It's
Attorney so
they
much.
they need to keep fucking making those things. I swear to God, Mr. Capcom, please. I I know, like I know you've been making that series for a long time, and the guy who does it is maybe not, he's maybe kind of exhausted the well of his ideas for that series, question mark, but like please get someone who also is interested in telling mystery stories, maybe, possibly.
And that just goes back to the crazy thing about Ace Attorney, which is that it doesn't necessarily have to be the same cast, because Dual Destinies is my favorite or not Dual Destinies, Great Ace Attorney is my favorite in the franchise.
Yeah,
And
Great Attorney rules.
it has nothing to do with the original Phoenix cast.
Yeah, like the only thing is that is like the background detail of, by the way, your main guy is actually Phoenix Wright's great grandpa. Is there any connection aside from this? No.
No.
Zero. There's absolutely none. And like,
there's thematic connections, like you have a quirky teenage girl assistant and your main prosecutor kind of looks like Edgeworth and the judge is there.
Yeah, the judge, and it's I feel like there's so many things you could still do with that setting and that formula too, right? Where it's like we've been through 2 time periods. One of them is contemporary to the right now, like 2014 to 2022 or something like that, like between those main games. And then like the late 1800s, early 1900s with Great Ace Attorney. There's an entire 20th century legal system in there that you could play with. There's, a lot of space to still do these kinds of fun mysteries and hang out with these kinds of characters without necessarily just going like, it's Phoenix is back. He stopped being disbarred for some reason.
Yeah, it doesn't. The overall plot doesn't matter to me nearly as much as very intriguing cases with an entire slew of very memorable and colorful characters. Like, to me, that's the thing that stands out the most, is that, like, over the years, I've forgotten a lot of the details of the cases, but every single person's, like, animations are just carved into my brain.
Yeah, like, and it's I think the strength of that series, that there's so much that you can do, like, with this, like, fairly restricted formula, limited tool set, limited scope. Just being able to move those pieces around and, like, tell a completely different kind of story.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that'll about do it for our special cut-in episode this week. If you liked it, you know how to keep listening to us, and also maybe if you haven't, you should go play a Phoenix Wright game.
You really should. It's always been one of my favorite game franchises, and it's a shame that they only come so rarely, because I tore through Great Ace Attorney and now it's done and I can't play it anymore.
They need to get the Star Wars thing where it's like, it's time for the 3rd trilogy, and it's like, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, please. Thank you. I'm so grateful for the food. I'm so full for mysteries. Yum. All right. Well, in that case, I think that we can cut off there, but I hope you'll join us next time for more gorging.
Yeah. Good night, everyone.
There are fundamentally 2 theories of communication. The first of these is signal. The idea that our world is defined through the lens of what we communicate. What is hunger, for example? It's a rumbling in your stomach, principally. Your visceral sensory nerves informing the central nervous system that you're low on raw materials. This information is communicated to your brain first as gentle yearning, and then as a deep itch, and then as knife-sharp pain. This is signal. Communication given a bespoke identity. The second of these theories is noise, a strange theory that supposes our world is defined not by what we communicate, but by what we don't. What's hunger? Well, it's a deviation from noise, a disturbance of the equilibrium. The visceral nerves communicate because their situation has departed from a favorable, unremarkable status quo. Satiety is the norm. Satiety is the world. Hunger is a momentary departure, the exception that defines the rule. Let me switch gears for a moment. The minimum number of people required for a podcast to exist is 2. One of these is the podcaster. In this instance, that's me. The podcaster's role is to create the podcast, to put thoughts to word and to weave those words together with varying amounts of grace. Without a podcaster, there's no podcast because no one makes it. If you make a podcast, you're a podcaster. It's a very simple calculus. The other person required for the podcast's existence is the audience. In this instance, that's you. You could be 10 people, or 100, or 1,000. You could be one person. You could even be me, talking to myself when I'm saying you. The audience's role is to listen to the podcast. That's it. From creation to completion, the audience is not required to contribute to the production of a podcast whatsoever. A podcast could be made which no one ever listens to at all. It would still be there, but no one would ever hear it. Without an audience, there is no podcast. With no one to hear it, a podcast can't be proven to exist at all. This hours-long audio file on your podcatcher could well be uninterrupted static, unobserved junk, if no one listens. But since you're here, you can safely say that it is in fact a podcast. For that, I thank you. Without you, this is nothing. Let me ask you, is truth, capital T, the truth, signal or noise? How do you communicate truth? Is it simply our name for a collection of abstract sensations and calculations and equations that we understand to be truth? Or is it something carved out of uncertainty, defined not by what is true, but triangulated from the many things which cannot be true? Imagine, for a moment, if humanity had evolved to only have rods in their ocular receptor nerves, no cones, the ability to distinguish light and dark, but no color to speak of. Nothing else about the universe is different. Is this world still a colorful place? Perhaps. The ability to see color means it's easy for us to think of color existing in a world even where we cannot see it. But for those who never lived with color, who never knew anyone who lived with color, even if it was there, it's not a useful way to conceive of the world. There's simply no context to describe it. This podcast, if nothing else, is signal. It is my signal to you. The signal cannot exist without the noise it distinguishes itself from. I am only a podcaster because of the audience listening to me. I am only as real to you as what you do with this signal. But whatever attention you've afforded me to this point, thank you for making me real. Hello, and welcome to The Gorge +1, where I, host of The Gorge, Saturn, talk about tabletop RPGs with my co-host this time, Oates.
Hi everybody, it's Oates. You all should know me by now because I've been on this podcast enough times.
Exactly. Today I'm thinking of, we go through a lot of stuff, like Pathfinder, Blades in the Dark, whatever, and I was thinking, today, we just kind of take a little bit to, talk about, our roots in tabletop, right?
Right.
How we got into the hobby, stuff like that. So, keep it pretty casual instead of getting into all sorts of, crazy meta discussion about this, that, and the other thing, and just have a fun time this time, instead of all the other times we do the Gorge +1.
Right.
So, I guess, what's your, first tabletop experience, I guess, that's for the audience at home?
So I talked about this before back when I was on Big Gay Nerds, but when I was 7 or 8, one of my friends invited me over to their house, and he and his dad were playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and this was in the 90s, so the game played different back in the day. It was really complicated, and I had no idea what I was doing, but I had a fun time anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
And it quickly grew from there when I got into middle school, and I interacted with a bunch of friends who were like, "Oh, I love GURPS," and it has basically been my life ever since.
Oh wow! I want to say my first tabletop experience. It was pretty late. I didn't really play a tabletop RPG until I was 18, I think, or close to that. And it was actually, Owen, friend of the Gorge, who was running, uh, a werewolf game, like from werewolf the something or other, not the masquerade. That's vampire. What's the werewolf one?
Oh my god.
Werewolf the something.
Would it have been the newer version or the old version?
How old's the old version?
Old enough.
It might have been the old version, frankly. I know it was like one of the White Wolf games. This is back in like 2013, I want to say.
It's not the Masquerade. I don't remember what it is.
Well, either way, it was from the Vampire the Masquerade people. They had a werewolf game. Where it's Vampire the Masquerade, but you're werewolves instead. And boy, let me tell you, that lasted one session. And immediately, I feel like there's a thing in tabletops of like, you have some nostalgia for your first system, right? Where it's like, your understanding of tabletop RPGs kind of goes back to that first system. I do not have a lick iota of nostalgia for Werewolf.
Understandable. I don't remember a lot of details, but I do remember you and Owen talking about it and me going like, oh.
Well, it's like, it wasn't even like the content of the game itself. It's just like the White Wolf RPG is like, because we played Exalted together too, right? And that's a very similar system where it has a very fiddly character creation, and then you have to roll a billion d10s every minute. And for my first experience in tabletop, it's like, oh fuck.
It's more than a little esoteric. Honestly, that's still a better option than starting with GURPS, because that's just like, that's like giving you an immersive sim, like as your first video game, you know?
Yeah, I haven't gotten the chance to play GURPS yet. We there's a campaign that we were thinking of starting that we did some character building for, but didn't actually start. But like I built a character for a GURPS that was like in a Star Trek kind of setting, right? And that is a really fun character building process for when you are experienced with RPGs, because it's all like, there's a ton of minutia. Is the thing, and it's not like complicated minutia. It's just like there's a billion options for everything.
Yeah, it's wonderful, because if you've played the original 2 Fallouts before, and if you played 3, but mostly New Vegas, like, you can see all of the little fiddly bits of that system, and you can tell that it was adapted from like these guys' attempt at making like a homebrew GURPS game.
Yeah, and like to me that's also like, and even though it's evidenced through Fallout, it's still one of the things that's cool to me about like the tabletop gaming space in general, is like, you can see, like, if you're looking at a lot of different games, you can see like the genealogy of like gameplay ideas between them, right?
Yeah.
Where like, you have advanced D&D, and like you have fairly simple, like, here's an armor class, you roll a dice and you find out if you hit, and here's how much damage you do. And like, even the way that mechanic has been like preserved through additions, but they still change it really wildly. So like, you had situations like in D&D 4 where you had THACO, which is, a mathematical nightmare, even though it's not actually like that complicated.
Yeah.
But it's just like, you go through so many different permutations and just kind of like reimagining the same mechanic, right? Kind of putting your spin on it and all that. And it's like, it's why you play a lot of different tabletop RPGs, and sometimes they do a lot of the same shit. Most Powered by the Apocalypse games and Fortune Dark games are doing basically the same thing.
Yeah, it's all 2d6 with really small modifiers, and they use a non-binary mode of success.
I bet they use a non-binary mode of success. But it's like, it's one of those weird things where it's like, and like, you find this out too, because aside from them being similar, it's like you find out, oh, Blades in the Dark started as a PBTA hack.
Yeah.
Like things like clocks and the ND6 and whatever are holdovers from PBTA. But then they're like, well, let's iterate on this concept in our own way, and like create like take the variable success things and turn it into like scope and risk for actions and things like that,
Yeah. It's fun having that sort of thing crop up frequently, like throughout like tabletop history, where people reiterate or refine concepts. and make it their own with their own system. Like about 12 or 13 years ago, me, Sarah, and Ben knew another fellow by the name of Dagda, who was like working on a really really unique system that took some inspiration, I feel like, from White Wolf, but was completely its own thing called Discipline Trigger, which was a really fun and fascinating little like point buy system, and did all sorts of weird stuff. And we eventually got not necessarily tired. We couldn't reiterate too much on what I think Dagda was going for, so we ended up switching over to lady like a unique like homebrew of Lady Blackbird, which is another powered by the apocalypse.
Oh god, I we played that once, didn't we?
I believe we did,
Or
actually.
we did a hack of it with your custom setting or something. That game's crazy. I love that game.
It's
It's really weird.
It's really weird. But I think like last year or the year before, I was like just getting nostalgic, and I was talking with Sarah about it, and we were just like, I think the way we could have handled some things in that system would have went like this. And as the night went on and she got drunker and I was sobering up, I was like, I think I can make a new system out of that. And I ended up creating it's it's still not quite finished yet, and eventually I'm hoping I'll get to like advertise it officially in some capacity. But it's effectively just a game of Yahtzee.
Combat Yahtzee, if I
Yeah.
understand correctly, because it's all like because if my understanding, if I remember the history correctly, right, is that Discipline Trigger was like based on effectively on Studio Trigger style anime shit, right?
Yeah.
Then the thing that you're doing is kind of more specifically like that through the lens of like Devil May Cry.
Yeah. I wanted the idea of like a really fast and loose combat system that is so snappy because you don't calculate like health or damage at all, that you're basically always rolling. It's always like a complicated mess of die, but you're just counting the number of like die are in there.
Yeah.
So there's no like without the extra math, the idea is that everybody is basically constantly rolling and seeing like fun big numbers go up without like doing a whole lot of things like calculating armor class and all that bullshit that D&D does, which is fun, but also like
it's for a
adds
different
a layer of complication.
Yeah, it's for a different kind of game for D&D,
Mhm.
because that's about like that has its genealogy in like military simulation, right? Where
Yeah.
you have to do that kind of stuff because you're whether or not a hit goes through is like potentially a matter of life and death. It's one of the cooler things, and like kind of like what I mentioned with like you specifically going for like a DMC vibe and like doing things with your gameplay that kind of synchronize better with like that style of like high octane super frenetic combat where the bullets are just flying, right? And like
Mhm.
you're just doing it, you're just going for it. And part of what I like about that is this like way that the mechanics of the tabletop games, right, have like they really say a lot about the kind of like story that you're trying to tell with the game.
Mhm.
It's a thing like with Blades in the Dark, and like there's a lot of Blades in the Dark hacks that are like called Forged in the Dark broadly. But there's a lot of them where it's like they'll like do a wildly different setting, right? They'll do something like a Gundam like Gundam is it panache? Pastiche, excuse me, that's the word.
Okay.
Pastiche. Panache is a completely different word. They'll do like a Gundam pastiche or like a Persona pastiche, right? But they'll do things like they'll keep all the same basic mechanics and just reskin them, which
Yeah.
is normally fine. But like Blades in the Dark is kind of going for a thief thing, right? Like the PC game
Yeah.
where it's all like brutal and horrible. And the idea is that you are playing a huge rotating cast of characters between however many players you have. And so your PCs are supposed to burn out real fast and real hard. But then they'll still keep those. And it's like, so if it's one of those things where it's like you really treasure when you get a Forged in the Dark hack where it's like, well, this is Forged in the Dark mechanics, but they actually like went to the effort of tuning out and tuning up the parts of the game they either needed more of or needed less of to actually make it like reflect the specific kind of narrative that you're trying to go for.
Yeah. I really like when people put in the effort to like make sure that the gameplay and the narrative seamlessly intertwine. And I feel like it's with the amount that is out there, it's easier to do than it used to be because like much in the same way that like people our age make like podcasts as a garage hobby. Like
Uh-huh.
I feel like people like slightly younger than us are doing the same thing but with like tabletops, which is
Oh yeah,
fantastic.
I follow a bunch of them on Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah, like what was I gonna say? Oh, my thought lost me for a second. But it's interesting to me, right, that there is such a resurgence of like that kind of garage hobbyist style of like, I think in the 90s they called them heartbreakers, right? Where like you put a ton of effort and time and money into making a system that might just end up not taking off and bankrupting you.
Hmm.
But it's like it's a really far cry from even like 5, 6 years ago when it was just like, and this is after like the McElroy's the Adventure Zone podcast got really big, when
Yeah.
all people were doing was just playing Dungeons and Dragons 5, but then trying to put things in Dungeons and Dragons 5 that that game is not designed for.
Right.
Even the McElroy brothers podcast, which had a bunch of stuff it wanted to do, and then at some
Yeah.
point, like near the end, you could tell that Griffin had went and listened to the Friends at the Table counterweight season, and then started trying to do wildly different shit with the game because he realized, oh wait, you can do things that aren't Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. Man, the resurgence of Dungeons and Dragons stuff when Fifth came out was I it's such a shame seeing seeing how it's decayed so quickly. It feels like there's only a staff of like 3 people on there, to be honest.
Oh yeah,
Because like comparing just the amount of splat books that came out of fourth in like the first year is more than what has come out in the entirety of the fifth season.
yeah, and this is like, and I can't help but compare it to Paizo, who makes Pathfinder, where
Mhm.
they're still putting out
Mhm.
like 2, 3 adventure paths a year. There is a frothing demand for whatever product it is they're doing, and they are just like gunning for it completely. Whereas,
Yeah.
and I think there's a part of this where it's like, to a certain extent, and I don't think this is true now, but like to a certain extent, D&D kind of has that of the tabletop RPGs, it kind of has that Nintendo mystique, I guess you could say, where it's the expectation that it's like you're getting something really classic and really iconic that's going to be a heavy hitter.
Yeah.
And they're still kind of operating with that mystique, even though the production realities of that, like like talent coming and going, like ideas being like picked up or abandoned or whatever, it's not necessarily still that caliber of product, but it still has that uh that's still like what the public awareness of it, right?
Mhm. It still maintains a level of polish that tricks you into buying a $60 splat book that is only like 30 or so dollars worth of value.
And then they'll like like, and you buy the splat book and you're like, wow, this is D&D content. Also, here's a part where they what's this? They put a player race that's just like mysticalized Romani stereotypes. Okay. All right.
Or they'll be like, well, we brought back all of these monsters and like a template for making races, but we should really stress you can't play some of the ones from like third and fourth that are very popular because uh we're taking a stance that they're just plain too evil.
God. Uh,
Poor Knowles.
oh, poor Knowles. Meanwhile, in Pathfinder 2, you can play a Knoll, and there's multiple different kinds of Knolls, including pygmy Knolls, who are the size of a gnome.
I miss Pathfinder so much.
Pathfinder 2 content has been really good. They like
Good.
it had a weird thing where like there's parts of that canon that changed when 2e came out
Yeah,
because
yeah.
they're like, hey, Pathfinder 1e had some like absolutely horrible shit in it, but like now that time has passed and we have authors who aren't exclusively white men, and we have a better awareness of like the impact of what
Now,
we're making.
Now
gonna
that,
just quietly retcon some parts of this.
now that it isn't 2003 and, like, Family Guy style shock humor isn't, like, in vogue. So
Yeah.
we can finally remove some of the
One of the things that was very odd to me is that, like, in Pathfinder's official setting, right? Like, you have
Mhm.
Absalom, which is like the capital of the world. It's like the Starstone city in the middle of the world, and all the settlements have like alignments, right? And it tells you kind of like what the general alignment of like the ruling powers and the populace are.
Mhm.
And Absalom has always been lawful neutral because it's just the big city. Their god is the god of banking and commerce, right? Like, they're completely value neutral, except they're called lawful neutral despite having had legalized slavery for like 4,000 years.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, and it's only in Pathfinder 2 now that they've had, like, the benefit of time and thinking about the things that they say with their game mechanics, where they're like, yeah, at some point in the recent canon they finally abolished slavery, so it's no longer a slavery is legal city. Please stop doing slavery RP in our game. It's against the intent. um
Oh.
Oh, Pathfinder, you sure have had a long and tumultuous road to become the good thing that you currently are.
Yeah. Oh.
Goodness gracious. Well, I think that makes for a good good short special episode, as is our wont. I guess before we go, what's your favorite system?
It's my favorite system. Oh fuck.
I realize I just dropped this on you, but what's a good question if not one that is sudden and that you will probably regret within 15 minutes of having given me a concrete answer?
Okay, like, throwing it out there. Out of all the things that I've worked with and all the things that I've played, I think one of the ones that I'm like the most in love with is I think it's Monster Hearts, because that's one of the few ones that I've done where I've completed 3 separate campaigns, and it's all been with people that I've really enjoyed playing with.
Huh.
Like, it's not really like there's nothing particularly strong about the mechanics themselves. It's more about like the experiences I've had with it are the most positive.
That makes sense. I like
Hmm.
that. That's a good answer. I think for me, I don't know if it's Blades in the Dark specifically. It might be Beam Saber, but it's at the very least a Forge in the Dark game,
Hmm.
whatever it is. Because I think my thing with Forge in the Dark, and I'll just say it's broadly Forge in the Dark, is that there's a really great, and I've had good experiences in lots of different systems. Like, we've had a mask block recently on Big Gay Nerds, and that's been a lot of fun. I love that system to bits.
Yeah.
But what I like for mask, we do end up doing a lot of freeform, right? But what I really like for Forge in the Dark games is that it takes, like, that PBTA style, like, tension and focus on the fiction in a way that, like, a lot of other kinds of system archetypes don't really do.
Hmm.
But it gives you really clear ways to mechanize that, both from like the player's perspective and the GM's perspective. So it's
Yeah.
like, whenever a player wants to like do something, as a GM, you can say like, well, okay, that would probably be like that would probably be like desperate danger, like you're doing something hot under fire, but would be really successful if it works. It'd be great effect. And then depending on what you roll, like, you actually have like quantifiable ways to say what is the reward for that roll, whether it was
Yeah.
like a abject failure or a eye-watering success, and it's like, I think it's a really underappreciated part of what you can do in the tabletop space, where you can like really find a way to mechanize the abstract parts of telling a story such that it makes the storytelling like a little more natural, but also a little more even.
Hmm. It it puts a lot more of the emphasis upon the players to like work with the GM on figuring out what to do next after you roll. Like,
Yeah, and understanding that, like, the things that you want as someone who maybe only cares about the story and not necessarily invested in the gameplay, but getting you to care about the gameplay by way of giving you a really concrete way to imagine how to make the thing you want to happen in the gameplay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think that'll about do it for the Gorge +1. I hope you'll join us next time for more of our tabletop chatter. Any last words, Outsy?
Um, God, I love rolling dice. It's just so satisfying.
Hell yeah, I love to get a little polyhedron and throw it at the table. It rules.
It does.
I like to see big numbies. Anyway, join us next week for some big numbies. Last autumn, a friend of mine very suddenly died. We weren't especially close. We played Pathfinder together. But she was my friend all the same. She had, for a month or so prior to the end of her life, been dealing with some frightening health issues. I'm not going to discuss them in detail. I can only say that they had some expressive and concerning symptoms. She was worried, afraid. The symptoms were having a severe impact on her day-to-day life. She went in to be consulted for imaging in October and was told her appointment would be in January. She was dead before the end of the month. Of course, no one knew what to make of it. It was also sudden. She just died one morning. I was shocked, horrified, and extremely, extremely angry. How could this happen? Her symptoms are so extreme as they were, how could she be made to wait so long? Didn't the people treating her have an ounce of concern? Couldn't they see something so obvious? I was remorseful because only a week or so before her death, I had undergone an MRI scan. I had a great many unexplained headaches from a singular point of origin and a family history of brain aneurysms. So, my insurance very quickly gave me the green light to get checked out. Only, as you might guess, I was completely fine. The MRI discovered only a benign fenestration in one of the brain's posterior arteries, a rare developmental deformity, entirely benign. Because of a quirk in my blood flow, I'd get migraines when my blood pressure was bad. That's it. Fine didn't save me, anyway. But if I could have somehow traded places with her, gave her my MRI appointment, taken hers instead, well, maybe she'd still be alive. That's what I thought, at least. I found out a week or two later, though, that her death had nothing to do with the mysterious illness that had been plaguing her. A blood clot that she didn't know she had came loose. It traveled through her bloodstream all the way up to her brain and killed her quickly. If they'd scanned the part of the body her mystery illness was believed to be connected to, they'd never have even noticed the blood clot either way. There's nothing anyone could have done to prevent this without at least having known what was going to happen in advance. Kind of pointless, miserable tragedy that happens every day. I didn't know what to do with myself. My small mountain of anger was washed away instantly by a sort of helpless confusion. I regretted not talking to her more, not reaching out more, not making a deeper connection. Obviously, the Pathfinder game we shared ground quickly to a halt. We were all mourning. They were even closer with her than I was. We promised we'd stay friends and keep playing together, that we'd keep her spirit alive through our adventures. But that fell apart almost instantly. 2 people couldn't keep playing because of school, and 1 because of a job. As it always did, for all but one of us anyway. Life got in the way. sometimes I wonder if, at the end of everything, I'll get to meet her again. When my flesh returns to dust and whatever's left of me crosses to a place I cannot now know. I wanted so badly after she left us to be able to bring her a story of years of friendship and adventure commemorated in her name. All I can bring her now is my guilt and sadness for having let her die a second time. Hello, and welcome back to That's Hell You're Walking Into, a Gorge subsidiary podcast where I and co-host Sara talk about the Fate property from Type Moon and all of the various happenings in it. Sara, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sara, the usual host of this program. However, things have gone horribly awry, and we find ourselves in one of the multifarious lost belts. Where
that's right.
History,
maybe the first one.
Yeah, this is where history has gone terribly off the rails, and now Saturn is in charge of. That's hell you're walking into somehow instead of myself. It's insane.
Yeah, there's a divergence in history. And a rock fell on somebody's head, and then they died and could no longer host the podcast, and then I took it over.
That's correct.
Is probably what happened there. Who knows? So usually for That's Hell We're Walking Into, we get into like more complicated subject matter, like minutia, you know, like, hey, why are the CCC servants like that? What's their deal? And that's all well and good. I love talking about like stupid, complicated horseshit because the series is basically just stupid, complicated horseshit. But I feel like sometimes it's like good to like focus in on dial in on like the basics, right? Because I think like there's so much in Fate. It can be very easy to get swept up in something and not, like, realize the vast totality of stuff there is. And so I was kind of thinking that for today's episode, we could focus on just talking about, like, the concept of the heroic spirits in general. Like, what it is they are and how they're used in the series, variably, to whatever extent that thing. So I was hoping you could do me the kindness of, like, giving me your, like, super shorthand version of like the heroic spirits.
The heroic spirit is a good shorthand version. The heroic spirit is in the ideal timeline where things did not go horribly wrong. Basically just a familiar that is a copy of the original hero that once lived, right? Like, I think it's an important thing, barring one very special case, and that is Saber herself. I think it's important to remember that the servant that is summoned is not the original person, but more so a record of their history and like who they were summoned into the present. And you might think that that's kind of splitting hairs because they're being summoned with like all of their they're being summoned with all of their memories and even the knowledge of what eventually becomes, like if you summon a younger version of someone, they are summoned with the knowledge of what becomes of them eventually. And that's all
very
they.
early in Fate Go, you get an example of that with Marie Antoinette, where
Yeah.
you summon this tiny little magical girl who talks about being the queen who couldn't save France for the revolution and got her head cut off for her trouble.
Right, and like Marie in Fate Go is like 15, 16 years old, standard, magical girl age, but she knows that eventually she will be like the Marie Antoinette who is, doomed to die no matter what. And
Right.
and yeah, I think like that's a really important distinction to make, is that they are copies, again, barring one, because all of the Nazi verse is about, here are the rules, now here are the exceptions to the rules. There's an awful lot of exceptions to the rules, yeah.
Even when it comes to heroic spirits,
Right.
like you mentioned with Saber, some of them come in the very first entry of the franchise, because also, like, I mean, this is getting a little bit into Fate Stay Night spoilers, I suppose,
Sure.
but it's a older VN. Like, I now have experienced a lot of it, even though I haven't finished reading it myself yet. But like what you get with Archer, also, of being like, well, he's a heroic spirit, but not really.
But like not really. He's more like he is more just like the representation of the counterforce. Like he is not a representation of the counterforce, that's not quite right.
He's like an agent of the counterforce.
He is an agent of the counterforce, yeah. And so he himself, like any agent of the counterforce could have been summoned, but because of, small circumstances leading up to, that necklace becoming so important to Emiya, that that this specific person was summoned, right? But like that isn't obviously, it's not the original Emiya, and it's not the original, like the guy who eventually became the counter guardian Emiya in all caps, right? Like this is still,
yeah, no, it's like the shadow he burned into mytho history, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to me that is one of the most important things, because there is kind of a tragedy there that I think is really interesting, that a lot of these servants get summoned, to do good, ostensibly, and their original purpose, now that you've finished Babylonia, you understand that their original purpose is to do something good, and they are never allowed to remember unless like they exist in perpetuity, like Medusa, right, who at the end of Heaven's Feel gets to have like essentially a second life.
And like you get a lot of interesting things with that, especially in Fate Go, where for instance, I just earlier today I finished the first Lost Belt finally.
Congratulations.
And you get a interesting thing with that, and one of the servants who shows up in that one, whose name is Avakebron, and he's a Golomancer. He's a philosopher from the I guess you would broadly call it like the Jewish historical tradition, right? He's a very famous Hebrew scholar, but he appears in a different property, right? In a different fate thing, and he does like he's pretty horrible in it. I can't be too specific because I only have a very limited awareness of that myself, but like he does some real nasty shit, and then he shows up in the first Lost Belt, and he's very helpful and kind and has some heart to heart with you, but he's still at a certain point has to grapple with the knowledge that was given to him, that in this other record, in this other time that he was there, he had still like done something horrible that, while to him feels out of character, he also acknowledges this, like it's something that he could have done.
Yeah, it's something that he's totally capable of. Right, yeah.
Yeah. So you get this interesting scenario where it's like, yeah, that was me, but it wasn't me, but it still kind of was, and I do have to take responsibility for it, even though I don't remember it, and like it's not me, and it's still like,
yeah.
And there's a lot of that in Fate Go. It's really fun.
Yeah, it's really good. It's honestly like one of my favorite things about Fate as a franchise in general is kind of the weird stuff that's going on with identity and kind of what makes you and the understanding that you might have like your own principles, and those principles can just as easily steer you to do like horrible things as they can steer you to do good things, and you are motivated 100% by the same ideals, right? And I think that's kind of, and that's, we talk a lot about, in That's How You're Walking Into, what makes an art or an altar. And the truth is that there isn't like a real good definition of what makes an altar. But I think what does make a good alter, or kind of the definition of an alter, is that they are still kind of fundamentally the same person, but it's just that those ideals kind of steer them off in a totally different direction, right?
Yeah, so like to give an example of one, and this is like much as the various different ways you can be transgender in Fate that seem to be reinvented from character to
From the
character.
ground up, yeah.
The ways you can be an alter in Fate are all very different, and like one of
Correct.
the more interesting ones to me is one that you get very early on in Orléans. And this is like spoilers for like the very first singularity in Fate, so bear with me. But in that Fate, you have to contend with this in that singularity rather, in that Fate, I'm talking like I'm a 14 player. In that singularity, though, one of the things you have to contend with is that Jeanne d'Arc has ostensibly been brought back to life and is now a vengeful ghost who is trying to destroy France with the power of evil dragons, right? And one of the first allies you run into is Jeanne d'Arc, but not the one who's summoning the dragons, like just like the young girl. And part of the tension of like that story, right, is that Jeanne d'Arc, your friend, is like, I'm not sure, like, am I the real Jeanne? Because this other Jeanne, like, also, like, has, you know, identifies as me and came for and like died like I did, and we both remember that, and like maybe she's the real one,
Right.
And there's this interesting thing where what you realize at like near the end is that the evil dragon's Jeanne is the altar. And the reveal that you get for this, the lead-in for it, is actually more interesting than like, because what happened is that like Gilles de Rais, who was mourning the death of Jeanne, tried to use a singularity to bring her back, and it couldn't actually bring her back because her soul went to the Throne of Heroes. So like that is not reversible. But instead, it made a copy based on Gilles de Rais' memory of her.
Yeah.
And the interesting reveal here is that Gilles de Rais' memory of her is someone who, you know, should be so angry because of her all the people who she loved and fought for turned on her, right?
Right.
And the reason why real deal Jeanne is able to figure out that she's the real one and Alter is the copy is because Alter can't remember all the good memories of like, you know, the people who she fought for. And it's why, like, even though your ruler Jeanne, right, she's so like, she's sad about having been killed by burned at the stake, obviously, but it's still like, because she fought for those people, they are still, her memories of her childhood and friends and family are still like kind of the thing that drives her. But it still creates this interesting thing where it's like the altar is still tied to her heroic spirit, right?
Yeah.
Like, it is still authentically her in some way.
Yeah, they are still kind of authentically, or at least have some of the same kind of belief systems. It's just that they're motivated in different directions, right? Like Jeanne Alter still like has like a faith in God. It's just, or a belief in God, I should say. But she's just extremely pissed off at God. Like, it's not that she doesn't believe in God anymore. She just thinks he's an asshole.
Yeah, one of her like very wonderful early lines is that she can no longer hear the voice of God, and then she's like, and this must be because God is mad at France, and so I must destroy France for being France. And I think it's like, obviously it's just wonderful. I do really love that her whole thing is, man, fuck France. I gotta burn France to the ground.
She's correct.
It also creates like, yeah, we should have let her. It would have incinerated human history, but maybe that's okay. But it is just one of those interesting things where like it still frames her outrage in like, it's not like the mud, right? Like, it doesn't just sort of turn her into like an evil monster that is like turned to the whim of some dark force beyond our reckoning, right? It is still authentically her. It's just, it's also not her.
Right. It's her through a different lens, but there are a lot of the same kind of feelings and impulses, but that different lens, you know, makes them much more angry and bitter versus like our Jeanne, who's kind of made peace with like what happened to her, but she does admit, you know,
she's everyone's big sister.
She's everyone's big sister, but she does admit that like when she was burning at the stake, she was angry, you know, like she did have some of that bitterness. So like there is a fragment of truth in Jalter. Like there is still something in there that makes her Jeanne, but at this point, you know, now they've fragmented off into such completely different people that they are their own individual, but especially in Orleans, they are, like, she is just kind of a reflection of Jean, who is still kind of dealing with the same, like, thoughts and feelings and beliefs, but kind of warped and more intense, right?
Right.
And I think, like, to me, that is, like, the most interesting thing of Fate, and why I still, like, why I just like it, even when there are things that piss a lot of people off, like they get mad about demi-servants, you know, which is just an excuse to have cameo characters show up, of course. But there is...
Oh, yeah, like pseudo-servants and all that,
yeah,
too.
pseudo-servants. Mash is a demi-servants. I mean, pseudo-servants are like Ishtar, right?
Those two words basically mean the same thing, but
they're different things, too. So frustrating.
Fate is a franchise where people make proper nouns and say,
Yeah.
we're going to clean this up later.
Yeah, don't worry about it. But pseudo-servants, like, I like a lot of the weirdness going on with pseudo-servants, like the fact that if you just summoned, like, the actual goddess Ishtar, which is what's happened in Strange Fake, she's a massive bitch. Like, she is an irredeemably horrible bitch, and that's how she is in the actual Epic of Gilgamesh, is that she's just wretched, right?
Yeah, she just sucks ass, and that's why Gilgamesh is like, no, I ain't marrying you. I'm having all this gay sex with Enkidu.
That's correct. That's the actual plot of the Epic of Gilgamesh. It rules. But, you know, she's like petty and vindictive and cruel for basically no reason, and is easily offended. And, like, yeah, the worst goddess Ishtar that we know is all of those things, but can also be kind of convinced down into being helpful and kind and good as well, because of the influence that Rin has on her, right? Like, the body she's summoned into is similar enough, but also there's enough of the original person in there to kind of make suggestions, right?
All right, to elaborate for the audience at home, who may or may not, who, as you know, this is an explanatory podcast, may or may not know that much about Fate. Right. The pseudo-servant is specifically, for one reason or another, the servant can't be summoned raw. Right. Either
divinities can rarely be summoned.
Right. Either it's like Ishtar, and it's a divinity, right? And it's just like, it is too powerful for a mage to summon, period, because it's a true divinity. Or it's like a more modern figure who's like, say, like, you know, like, Grigory Rasputin, perhaps, who is just spiritually has too weak of an essence to be summoned independently. Mm-hmm. And so you have to basically have a stopgap. Like, you have to have a medium, which is where a pseudo-servant comes in, which is that you are basically summoning the servant into someone's body. Because ultimately, servant's a kind of ghost, right? Like, it's a copy, but it's like a ghost.
Yeah.
And normally they, like, comprise themselves of ether and, like, give themselves corporeal flesh out of magic. Mm-hmm. But in the case of the pseudo-servants, like, they literally just put the ghost of this somehow inopportune servant into a human body.
Right.
In the case of Ishtar, she's a character from the original Fate Stay Night, who is a kind of just wonderful, low wisdom, high intellect tsundere witch child.
Correct.
And that enables her to be much more easily influenceable than perhaps the real deal Ishtar, as it were. But also, you know, it has, I think the specific figure that Ishtar says, it's like, it's a 70-30 split, at least initially.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, it's been a while since I've read since I've read Babylonia, but I do remember the anime more clearly because I watched that more recently. And that conversation is also in the anime, where she explains that it's like a 70-30 split, but also it's kind of like they are now one and the same person. It's very kind of complicated the way all Fate things to do with identity are, in a way that I think is really interesting and cool. And like, I don't know, that's, to me, that continues to be one of the cool draws of Fate as a franchise in general, is just kind of playing around with perceptions and identities and what makes you, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. That actually ties into, like, one of the other things I think is really cool about the heroic spirits, right? And it's like, so we talk about Saber, who is King Arthur, Artoria Pendragon. I'm not going to use the heretical Nasuization of that name. But her thing is that she is her spirit origin, her like mytho-historical footprint that put her in the Throne of Heroes and can be summoned as servant or whatever, is like a conflation of a real historical person who is Artoria Pendragon and the myths and legends of King Arthur, right?
Right.
And so it's like there's a degree, and like we get this a lot with the altars, but also like with the alter egos and the other like really weird outside cases for servants, where it's the mytho-historical footprint is not an infallible metric. It
Right.
can be duped effectively.
Yeah, you can,
like you can
can
have
fuck with it.
situations. Like you can have situations like there's a ton of different Artorias and Fate Go, and a lot of them are like, well, this one's one that kept the Excalibur. This is one that didn't keep the Excalibur but had the Rongaminiod, which had a different effect on her personality. This is one where it's before she really had either, and it's like there are a lot of, and also you have what is very funny to me and currently relevant to when we're recording this is Paul Bunyan, who is a 1-star berserker divine spirit. And it's like, well, why can you summon Paul Bunyan? And it's like, the reason you can summon Paul Bunyan at all is because even though they are a divine spirit, their origin is just has so many different weird little variations and is like so slapdash that you can only like the divine spirit can only ever be at like 1% power,
right?
You know,
yeah,
and so you
absolutely.
can just summon her and it's fine. And it's like, I think it's a very neat thing because it's not just like contending with the historical impact that these figures had, but it's also like how that historical impact can have an effect on, how do I put this? It's almost like the representations as the different kinds of heroic spirit are kind of like different versions of them that are in a very real way like shaped by the circumstances of the stories that are being told about them.
Absolutely, yeah. That determines, you know, we talk a lot about how there can only be one Grand Saber, right? Like because of the nature of like grand servants are like, again, because this is an explanatory podcast, the grand servants are like the idealized form of each of the original 7 classes. So, you know,
they
like
are the biggest, best, and most powerful of them
right,
all.
the 6-star versions.
For like pretty much for like non-spoiler thing, like the Grand Assassin is basically the incarnation of like the Grim Reaper, period.
Yeah,
like it's not just the Grim Reaper, but it's effectively the Grim Reaper.
He is effectively the Grim Reaper, and he is also like the founder of the Order of Assassins. Like,
right,
he is the literal origination of the word assassin. It can only ever be that one person, right?
Right, and so as a result, he is the ultimate assassin. Like, you stack up any other assassin to him, and it's like, well, you can't beat an assassin who can kill you by way of introducing the concept of death to you existentially.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, that's more deadly than any knife. Just like, I have decided existentially that you are dead. Period.
That you know that you are capable of being dead. Yeah. And in the same way, you know, we talk about perceptions and how that it influences the servant, and how there can only be one grand saber, and we don't know how they're going to navigate it, and they could make it extremely stupid or it could be super raw. Who knows? But there is only one truly famous sword in the world. There are other swords that are famous, but if you stopped a person on the street and said, name a famous sword from history, like a named important sword from history, I would say 95% of the population would say Excalibur, right?
Yeah, I think the other 5% say like Damocles or something, right? Because it's like a figure of speech, or they say like Occam's razor if they want to be clever,
right?
But it's still like, you know, there is and that's the interesting thing about her expectation to me. Like, so in the sixth singularity, Sanzang talks about like the incarnation of the heroic spirits as servants also, and how that's a thing that is kind of miraculous even in like the setting of Fate, right? Where it's like normally when the Throne of Heroes is drawing on your power, the specific example Sanzang gives, being like a Buddhist monk, is that like sometimes when people do really well on a test, it's because they were drawing on the heroic spirit power of Sanzang.
Right.
And I think, and this is actually diverging just a little bit, but it's one of the things one of the other things I think is really interesting about the heroic spirits, and specifically their incarnations as servants, right?
Mhm.
Where, and this is a anxiety that Sanzang touches on specifically, is why I bring her up, which is that you are traditionally in Fate, they are incarnated into the world as a result of a Grail war, and
Mhm.
Fate Go stretches that just a touch, just a hair,
Just a
uh,
skosh.
just a little bit. But effectively, they are the ghosts of the past given mortal bodies again for the sake of fighting,
Mhm.
a dramatic conflict that could shape the flow of human history. And this is kind of, it relates a lot to things like the Arthurian legend and the idea that King Arthur would come back when Britain is in danger to save it, right?
Right.
Like, and that's why she's the once and future king.
Mhm.
But also, this kind of like, there's this anxiety about being brought back into the world as a visitor, right? Where it's
Mhm.
like you are incarnated as this ghost fighting to protect a world that you can never truly be a part of again.
Right.
And I think that's the other real interesting thing about the servants, because it's like there's this like melancholy to it, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right?
And you have like, and like I mentioned with Avikabron earlier, where like he did a lot of bad things in the service of advancing his personal goals that he has as Avikabron,
Mhm.
but they are all kind of transient because he can't actually be, Solomon ibn Gabirol again,
Mhm.
right? He can only ever be the heroic spirit of Ikabron.
Right.
And like, I don't know, there's just something about that is like, there's a particular like texture to that melancholy aspect of the power fantasy of like leaving a mark on history and being able to come back as a superhero to protect it. I think
Yeah.
it's really fun. Well, fun's a weird word. It's really sad. Um,
Sad and interesting.
it's sad and interesting because you have all these, and a lot of people who are heroes, but also some people who aren't, like Anastasia from
Mhm.
the last of the Romanovs, who has a heroic spirit incarnation. Even though she's not a hero, she's just someone who left a footprint on mytho history,
Right,
right?
yeah.
And this knowledge that you can come back, you can be a servant, you can be a heroic spirit, but it'll always be kind of in the past tense of your ability to matter, you
Yeah.
know?
At this point you can only kind of exist in the world for a very brief point in time, and there isn't really a lot you can do to make an impact on it again. And so in a lot of ways, like, Sanzang says that it is a miracle that servants get to live again, because they do get to kind of come back from the dead, and because they are, they're all aware of their deaths. They're all, because of the way they're summoned, they're given all their information. They're aware of how they died, so they know like how they went out, and they are given this opportunity to walk in the world again, even if they can't make an imprint on it anymore because of the nature of their summoning. And there's a lot of texture there, right? There's a lot of like interesting melancholy, and it's sad, but it's also very beautiful to just be able to say like, yeah, I had this one chance that billions of people will never have, to get to live again after death, and potentially like protect the world that I existed in once before, and I get to come back and do it again. And yeah, there's something really beautiful about that, and like you said, just crushingly sad too, because you never get to kind of, again, like the way they did in life, you never get to see the fruits of your labor. You fight in a Grail war to protect the world, but once the war is over, you're gone.
Right.
And so you never get to see kind of the fruits of your labor. And in the case of the Grail war, although again, FGO kind of fudges those lines, you don't even get to remember that you did it.
Mm-hmm.
And like, there is, that is a sadness to kind of have to deal with. And I like it a lot. I think a lot of the kind of touching, the best touching moments, especially of Fako, are born out of that, right? Are born out of this idea that you get to live one more time, like, to
You can
be,
relitigate, the
yeah,
mistakes of your past, like in the case of Berserker from the original Fate Stay Night.
right,
of his tragic end being poisoned and driven mad that made him kill his whole family. And then his connection to Eliasville, this little girl who he will do anything to protect so that he can relitigate the horrible tragedy that spelled his end.
Yeah,
right?
or to be more vague for the sake of no spoilers, but like, what is going on with the true Solomon, if not an attempt to relitigate his entire life into something he has more control over, right?
Right, exactly.
And that's the tragedy of that character. I think that's everybody who's played Fate Go is extremely sensitive about that character for a reason, because he did his best to kind of reshape his life, and at the end Destiny kind of came back and snatched him back in anyways, right? So he kind of was only ever going to be one thing, and he got more of a chance to go out and live, but at the end of the day he still had to be like King Solomon and live up to his responsibilities, and
he could only ever be King Solomon to a certain degree.
No matter how much he
it's the horrible irony of his wish, for vague spoiler reasons, is that like he could only ever be King Solomon, even when he didn't want to be necessarily.
Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, of course everybody is to this day extremely sensitive about that character.
Yeah, a good character.
Great
honestly,
character.
It is only finishing the singularities for the first time. I'm like, wow, Fate Go is actually really fucking good.
Extremely fucking good. Yeah, it's a huge problem to be like, I had like, how do I convince people to play Fate Go when it is there's so much of it, and there's so much of it that's just dog shit, right? And you have to be like, no, I promise it gets so good.
It's also just so big, and the things about it that you like are like, I can't tell you about this because it'll make you not enjoy it when you get
and to even explain the game, like the video game part of the video game, not just the story, but the video game part is like, there are so many like obfuscated mechanics that the game itself just doesn't bother to tell you about ever, and so you have to convince somebody to play this mobile game that is a gacha game and be like, no, I promise it gets good, but I need you to wade through 40,000 miles of the Grail mud to get to it, right?
Yeah, it might drive you crazy, but if you have faith in me, I will protect your spirit origin and prevent you from being corrupted.
I promise it'll be okay. Or you'll come out of it completely insane like myself and unable to shut up about Fate Grand Order and Fate Stay Night. And I suppose that's an okay outcome too, because at least then you have a lot of other people who will be insufferable about Fate Stay Night with you, right?
Exactly. Well, I think that makes for a pretty good episode, and we covered a lot of the basics. And hey, if you haven't played a Fate thing before, and you thought this episode of That's Hell You're Walking Into is interesting, maybe you should get off your ass and play it. There's been like 20 episodes of this shit?
There's 20 episodes of this shit. You can go read the original visual novel, go fucking, or watch the anime.
That. It's pretty good.
It's pretty good, right? Nasu's a pretty good writer. It's like, damn, all right.
He's very punchy and direct in a way that there's other visual novels that I like that I might prefer because they're a little more flowery, and I do love some flowery fucking language, but Nasu just gets to the fucking point. It's great.
He's extremely he's very direct, and even like the stuff he's written for Fago is also like very direct and very just like, here is the thing I'm trying to tell you about the thing, right? All of the themes are out there in the open, and they're not subtle, and that's kind of the interesting thing, is that they aren't subtle at all. So it's like, well, we're not even going to bother.
I know authors who use something. They're all cowards.
So we're going to roll up our sleeves and really get elbow deep in this shit, kids. And it's like, okay, fine. Get up all in its guts.
Well, if you would like get all elbows deep in Fate Grand Order, this is my or any Fate product really. Correct. This is my encouragement to go to. So it's pretty good.
Yeah, glad I gave you these brainworms.
A few short months ago, my partner and I broke up. It was amicable and smooth. We both felt the relationship had simply stopped being a relationship, at the very least a romantic one. We started as friends and became friends again. We've both always been placid people like that. We both wanted to live our lives at our own paces. Both of us wanted things that were just easier to get alone than with a roommate. We both spent months agonizing over the breakup, and then it just sort of happened one day. And everything washed away, just like that. One difficult discussion to end nearly 6 years of cohabitation. As I'm speaking these words, they've only been moved out for a little over a week. Even though I know we'll continue to be friends, and even though I know it's for the best, and even though I'm already getting used to living by myself, it's difficult not to mourn what we used to have, the people we used to be, the places we used to go, the things we used to do, the love that we used to share. While our relationship slowly died, it was easy to think of those things as simply being part of the younger phase of the partnership. But now, it's all past tense. Memories that seem so much more distant now for having been well and truly refuted. Nostalgia's a funny thing. I was there for those early years. I know full well that mixed in with the young romance, there was a lot of anxiety and pain, too. There was friction. There were struggles. It was never really easy. And yet, when I think of that time in our lives, I find I can only really clearly remember the fun parts. The laughter, the closeness, the understanding. They were hopeful, starry-eyed times in my memory, at least. At some point, for some reason, the relationship ended. This was months before we broke up, maybe even longer. I don't know why exactly. I probably will never know why exactly. I believe that we just grew apart, as people are so often said to. 6 years can feel like 1,000 in the right context. Despite never leaving each other's side, we became different people and found our comfort in different places. The world we built together gathered dust and crumbled away. As the Witch of Mirrors, I try to be an adaptable person. To reflect light and to reflect sound require different properties. To be a perfect mirror, you have to be perfectly suited to anything you might need to reflect. The mirrors of harmony, beauty, truth, and inevitability all demand a different surface, different material. So, I must be willing to be anything. This is comfortable and natural for me. I couldn't articulate my own real shape if I tried. But I wonder if being so formless has made me undependable. Is being willing to change so thoroughly that you'd let every part of you be discarded a weakness? One could argue adaptability is the mark of survivability and triumph. A dedication to thrive in any environment that you find yourself. But when I look in the mirror, all I see is an exhausted puppet, a familiar kind of stranger to whom I know I must protect but have no real attachment. I wonder if that person I see is capable of being loved. I wonder if they're capable of loving at all. They must have been once, but now I'm not so sure. It and I cannot help but hurt each other. Hello and welcome back to the Gorge, Gorges about Final Fantasy XIV. Joining me today, I am your host, obviously, as always, Saturn, and joining me today is long-time listener, first-time caller, Shia. If you'd like to tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Shia. You may know me from the Patreon read-off at the beginning of every episode.
Yeah. So what we're here today specifically to talk about, though, more than that, is Final Fantasy XIV. So as you are all well aware, me and some other people on the podcast have spent a prodigious amount of time talking about the ins and outs of every plot beat, yada yada yada. However, there's specific thematic things that I really wanted to zone in on that are like important to me, as you know, things that I think are part of the heart of the story of FF14. And I want to talk with those about Shia as well because they involve one of Shia's favorite characters. And this is about specifically redemption, which is to say, like, bad people who do bad things and how much they should be held to account for those things in the face of, you know, how rough they may have had it or what options they may have had or how they ended up being if they had some kind of face turn or anything like that. And so I guess specifically, I wanted to ask you if you could start off by like giving me kind of a lowdown for a character who I think is a really great representative of this, who is Yotsuyu from Stormblood. If you could like kind of give me the gist of that character.
Yeah, so I'm glad this is the topic we're going with. It's definitely something that is near and dear to my heart, and I think like a big part of what is otherwise definitely a somewhat benighted expansion in Final Fantasy XIV. But this always really stuck out to me specifically, and because it never got a great chance to like get talked about much. So I'm glad we're doing it now. And Yotsuyu is in many ways a very monstrous figure in Stormblood. She is the viceroy of Doma, working under the Empire of Garlemald, and she is extremely like physically directly abusive, um, in like a very not sure how to put this delicately, um, a very dominant way, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, she sends many people to die. She tortures her subordinate until he becomes a doom guy, literally. Um, and then is crushed beneath the rubble. But then she's not crushed. She survives without her memory. And
yeah, so that's kind of like one of the more interesting bits of her character and like what really turns her from being kind of a, I guess to me, a one-note villain into a character that has a lot of depth, which is that, you know, she has this very complicated and tragic backstory,
right.
and her ascension to imperial power is basically she got sent to kill the big bad prince and couldn't do it, and she instead, being impressed by her chutzpah among other things, was like, "No, you take over this viceroy job."
Yeah.
And but she kind of like there's this degree to which she views the entire population of this place she's in charge of as being responsible for the personal misery that led her to being the person that she is. And you know, like this kind of like tortured villain thing is not like a new form of characterization. It's, you know,
No.
something that a lot of hack movies will use to make you think like, maybe he wasn't such a bad guy after all or whatever. But what really becomes interesting to her, and like when after you kind of finish the events of Stormblood proper and she has been crushed under a building, is when she comes back and she is a complete amnesiac. She's, by all accounts, seemingly reverted to this kind of childlike state, right? And you're immediately forced to contend with, well, first off, this is definitely bad, because this is someone who, you know, the people who she's hurt recognize, and she is in a, you know, very she's in a somewhat tenuous place, let's say. But also, we still are, and one of the questions that Stormblood is kind of interested in asking about this situation is like, how are we defining justice for what happens to this character who is no longer capable of, like, comprehending the things that she did during her long reign over Doma?
Yeah. So there's two things with Yotsu I really want to talk about, and you can decide what makes the most sense to you. But I want to talk specifically about her beginning, not her very beginning, but the short story on the Final Fantasy XIV website where she meets Xenos, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is so fascinating for both these characters.
Yeah,
And then I
you
want
should
to talk
definitely.
about the very end.
Yeah, you should tell us about both those things, because for me, like, I know the gist of the story, but it has been a very long time since I've read it. So I would love for you to tell us a bit about what's going on there, because I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of people who played FF14 who might not have ever read it because they might not have known that there was official short stories published on the FF14 website.
Yeah, they're pretty easy to miss. I have not read in a while either, so I'm just going to give you kind of the gist as well. But I do think it's so illustrative. The thing with Yotsuyu is that she is a Doman who sincerely hates Doma. And part of that is what comes up in 14, the game, of this parental abuse. But after that, there is this period of her working um, in a brothel as a sex worker, but also as a spy, essentially a honey trap for a honeypot for Garlemaldian military officers to spy on them after sleeping with them. This was a thing the government of Doma had her do while she was working as a prostitute. And what gets her pulled into Xenos' orbit is that she is supposed to do this to Xenos. And him being the little freak that he is, God bless him, just completely no-sells her attempt to seduce him.
Xenos has never been horny his entire life.
Yes, essentially, Xenos has never been horny his entire life, and he wouldn't even know how if he tried. Um, he does not know what to do with his hands.
No, he doesn't know what to do with anything in general. I feel like, except for the part where he kind of makes explicit allusions to just not having been impressed by people trying to court him, I always imagine him as being kind of this big boss sort of figure, where it's like someone has to explain to him at 38 years old what sex is.
Exactly. And Yotsuyu has to explain to Xenos what sex is. No.
She doesn't do a very good job, which is
not
why
do it-
she's in this situation.
She does not do a very good job. But basically, Xenos likes the cut of her jib and recruits her to the Garlemald side to do Garlemald's bidding, which for her is pretty easy because she just does not. She has no positive associated with Doma at all, and that ultimately leads to her joining the Garlemaldian military apparatus and kind of rising up the ranks through her resourcefulness and basically just being extremely vindictive. Sorry.
Yeah, because it's also worth touching on before we continue. Part of why she is so harsh on Doma specifically is because, and this is something that you kind of get slow reveals of as you go through the game, but it's her own parents who kind of originally sold her off in that way for their own benefit and no concern of hers. And then even when she kind of got out of the situation that she was in as much as she could, the country that should have been no, this thing that they did to you is horrible, we should, help get you back to where you need to be, was well, what if we exploit your trauma for our own gain with also not really considering your status? And her sort of resentment to Doma is kind of this thing of having to contend with this entire society of people who she views as being basically having been responsible for every ounce of misfortune in her life and never having, even when had the opportunity to step up and do the right thing and make things okay, instead chose to double down and make her life worse.
So what she's essentially done is create a cycle of abuse between her and a society.
That's right. That's a really good way of putting it, honestly. Because since she is so vindictive to the populace, she makes things worse, and the populace hate her more, and they cause her more problems, so she mistreats them more.
Yeah, and not to jump ahead, but what we're going to see, in the later parts of this whole plot arc, even into, Suffy and Endwalker, is the cycle of abuse coming back from society and, and having to kind of try and diffuse it and do an job.
Yeah, because you can't really, you can't unring that bell, as
Right.
some people say, and it's like there's a significant part of this, like, and as we talked about Endwalker on the show before, like, and not, we didn't get too much into the role quest, but
Right.
like, there are things that's in there, but it's like Hien is also someone who is very significantly responsible for a lot of the later stages of this, like, collective psychic trauma, right?
Yeah, and we'll
Where,
definitely get into that.
yeah, and so it's like, and it's also, he tries his best to deal with it, but he doesn't do a great job, and even if he did a better job, you can't really fix all that anyway.
Yeah, no. I actually like I'm very critical of Heian in a lot of ways, as I think you know. But I actually do find his most of his demeanor with Yotsu specifically to be one of his more positive sides, with the one big exception we'll get to.
Yeah.
But he does sincerely try and like see things from her point of view, which most people in Doma do not. Uh, but I guess the question, before we kind of get into that aspect of it, the question that comes to my mind with Yotsuyu and this kind of story, how much trauma can a person endure before finding the only solution is then to push that trauma out on others who they now have power over? And that's kind of what this character is.
Yeah, I think so too, because, like, Yotsuyu is also, to a very real extent, I think, one of the few people in FF14 who is explicitly cruel for coping reasons.
Yes.
Like, there's people like Emmett Selk who
Emmett
do
Self together
things
comparison, yeah.
who do things where it's like, oh, this is simply utilitarian from my perspective. But for her, this is her reward for having endured what she did, and finding that even in a place of power, she has never actually gained closure or peace of any kind.
Yeah, no, like there is no. I think it is definitely a thing that even as like the castle collapsing around her, like she didn't really enjoy any of it. I don't think. Um, she she used it as an outlet, but it didn't really satisfy what
Right.
she wanted. Um, so yeah, is that a good point to pivot to kind of the end of the story?
I think it's a good place, yeah, because I think we got a good bit of the middle in there, so you can kind of lead us up to the end. And
Because what I do think happens afterwards, like it could have been a very bad plot line, I think, in a lot of different ways, but they actually really, I think, definitely kind of thread this needle, where after the castle collapses around her, she loses her memory, and she becomes a very innocent, maybe
she's
childlike,
like,
or
there's absolutely, like, an age regression thing happening there. Like, she
yeah,
is talking like a child does.
she is. But I'd say it's also that she is now this like a version of herself without the trauma. She is a
Yeah.
person who's been separated from that and put into a place where there are people. Maybe I'd say Gosetsu loves her in his own way.
Yeah.
But there are people who are supporting her and are protecting her and are treating her well. And that's never happened ever. Certainly not from the Empire. As much as she uses it, the Empire does not treat her well either.
No.
And Zeno certainly doesn't. He doesn't carry the way. So this is the first time in her entire life where a version of her has been allowed to be happy and loved and feel safe. And I think the person she is really interesting. I think Tsuyu, is that what it is? It's been a while.
Yeah, she goes by Suyu instead of Yotsuyu.
Right. And yeah, like this version of her is pretty straightforward, but it's very sweet. And all the drama is basically just all the other characters trying to figure out what to do with her.
Yeah, and, like, so since we've gone over, and, like, we can continue through, because I believe we talked about this in one of the episodes where we went through kind of things that happen in Stormblood, but kind of where she ends up going is that through a confluence of circumstances, she is kind of confronted by her younger brother,
funny.
Asahi, who is also a Garlean. He was adopted by a Garlean noble family at a much younger age and got to that place significantly easier than Yotsuyu did, by all accounts.
Mm.
And Asahi has a vested interest in, putting his sister in her place as he sees it and making a nuisance for Doma, and is this force of, while everyone is trying to, kind of protect this fledgling new personality and like figure out what justice looks like for someone like her, Asahi, and crucially also the people of Doma themselves, are insistent on saying, no, you can't just forget this.
Right.
You are Yotsuyu. You cannot be this other thing. You have to, live with who you are, what you've done, and what you've been through. And kind of the horrible tragedy here, right, is that the way that this gets really cemented is that Asahi sets up a meeting kind of covertly for Suyu, still kind of in her, fugue state, to meet her parents, like her birth parents, the people who sold her into sex slavery explicitly.
Right.
And they return to being the same kind of abusive and uncaring people they were. And that bell can't be unrung. She remembers everything, and she kills them both in cold blood. Or I suppose hot blood, actually, considering. But
there's something I want to say there. By the point she does that, she has already regained her memories. I think Asahi said something or something. I forget exactly what happens that causes them to start coming back. So she has this period of time where she is kind of both Yotsuyu and Suyu, and is actually now trying to digest, I guess, the memories of like this real affectionate relationship she had with Gosetsu.
yeah.
And her first impulse is to kill herself. That's what she comes out there to do.
Right.
And then Asahi brings in the parents, who are exactly as wretched as they've always been, and that's when Yotsuyu murders them with the knife she had brought for herself. And at that point, she makes the choice she makes at that point is really interesting. I want to hold off on it a little bit, but basically she decides to go all in on evil again at that moment. But her first impulse was, I cannot live with these two parts of myself in discordance. That was her initial drive.
Right. And like she finds herself in that place where between Gosetsu, who, has been taking care of her and is affectionate, and also her memories of the life she's lived, I feel like there's some part of her character psychology, right, that says, right, I cannot possibly reconcile these things. Mm-hmm. And it would be better to both myself and the people who I've left in my wake and the people who've been taking care of me since I, became this new person effectively, if I just didn't exist anymore.
Yeah. No, that is where she is at when she makes that choice. And I think that really informs what comes after, because what follows is, in my opinion, I think one of the most harrowing and genuinely traumatic moments of World of
Warcraft.
God, Final Fantasy XIV.
World of Warcraft wishes Ishikawa was writing any of this.
I think never. Final Fantasy XIV, particularly before Natsuko Ishikawa actually takes over, because as much as we say it, this was not her.
I believe she was actually at this point. She wasn't doing the entire narrative, but I believe she was responsible for at least the Doman half of Stormblood.
She wrote the Doman part of the main campaign. I don't think she wrote this. But
that's true. That's actually possible. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. But yeah. So what happens here, and what really kind of struck me, is that Yotsuyu leans hard into Asahi's plan to steal crystals and summon herself as a primal, like Ysel does with Shiva, and essentially conspires to commit suicide by, as I was saying, suicide by cop. She commits suicide by God killer. She becomes a god so that you, the warrior of light, will kill her.
Yeah, and despite your best efforts, that's kind of what happens. In the fight, you're, trying to take her down, and you get this, first off, that fight has killer music. It might be one of the best tracks in all of Final Fantasy XIV.
Can I say something about that?
Yes.
I love this fight. I love that music. It's my favorite. It's probably the best thing. It's probably the best art about colonialism in Stormblood, honestly, because you have this thing where like there are two singers, or there's two sets of lyrics. There's the woman singing in Japanese about how hard it is to live and how much they're suffering, and then there's this chorus that's alternating with her speaking in English, basically driving them on and pushing them to do action. And it's this real interplay between like the pain she feels and essentially the stand-ins for Garlemald pushing her onward and creating this like violent tempest. It's really it's very artistic.
Yeah, it's genuinely like one of, I think, the, like, again, like not just musically one of the best tracks, but it's also like aesthetically one of the most powerful tracks in the entire game, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely.
Because of like the cool formalistic things it's doing. But yeah, so you're trying to fight her. You know, there's a part in the middle of the fight where she is kind of being besieged by her own demons.
Yes.
And you get this incredible moment where her image of the caring Gosetsu defends her from the vengeful spirit of Xenos, basically, in the fight. It extremely whips, which is, you know, a very unscientific thing to say about it. It extremely whips, but you know,
it's so cool. She summons ads to attack herself. It's very neat.
yes, because again, she's trying to die is her thing.
Yeah.
And you are able to overcome her. And I believe what happens here, I remind me, is it that Asahi goes around you to actually plant the final blow on her? Is that what happens?
No, I think she is down after you strike her down. She's still like vaguely primally, like her hair is like still white, and then he like the little asshole that he is, he like walks up to her to like taunt her, and then she like summons the last of her power, like stab him twice.
Thank God. Old freak deserves it. Sorry,
Yeah,
Asahi,
no.
but also
God,
you're welcome.
we'll never see his face again.
And yeah, she, you know, despite everyone's best hopes for her, she does like leave the world in this kind of state of like, well, I was never going to live as Suyo. I was
Yeah.
never going to be able to have that happy life because I had all this pain happen to me, but I was at least able to get revenge on everyone who made my life miserable. And you leave it thinking, well, fuck, that sucks.
Yeah, I do think it's an interesting like escalation from like I'm going to kill myself to I'm going to kill myself in the most extra way possible to I'm going to kill myself in the most extra way possible and take down the people I hate most with me. It's that escalation of like her character that I think like kind of drives that plot arc forward.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because there's like two things it's kind of doing at the end of that, because that's very near to the end of Stormblood. It's not the
Right.
actual like finale of Stormblood, but it's like basically the climax of Stormblood.
Climax, yeah.
But it does two things that are interesting. First is it makes you feel like shit. And
Yes.
Stormblood's been really good at that, but that is like the nail in the coffin of Christ alive, this entire DLC is horrible. What am I doing?
Oh.
Should I stop?
Oh, you know, the thing we didn't really talk about that we absolutely have to talk about for doing a talk about Yotsuyu is Heian and that aspect of it. Which is that after spending a whole campaign putting Heian in power, when the topic comes up of the pimp that you know sold Yotsuyu as meat and just used her in that way, and Heian makes a point that we need to like utilize him because of whatever nonsense Heian says. Heian has some sort of excuse and he doesn't want to deal with it. Essentially, is what it comes down to. It's too much trouble to.
Heian has like everyone else who's in a position of power on the good guys' side in FF14, he's got neoliberal brain rot.
That's not even. Yeah, no. His power is so his power is so weak at that point, as far as he sees it, that he cannot do anything about this pimp that is helping his cause. And
yeah,
that's just one of many ways we see Doma it doesn't feel good to have put that guy in power at that moment. Is what I can say about that.
No, because again, we see this thing of like having gone through all this horrible thing of like, hey, here's what happened to this character and the ways this kind of corrupt society failed her specifically. And being like, well, literal like political revolution via violence and putting someone new in power uh not only did not address the problem, it has actually kind of entrenched it in a way that
Yes,
makes it worse.
which never happens in real life revolutions. I'll tell you that much.
Oh yeah, definitely not.
Yeah, and we don't need to talk about this because that is something that Ben and Sarah talked about in extensive detail. But like, this is not that long after the salt mines thing.
Yeah.
The end of Stormblood is basically about making you feel bad that you participated in the events of Stormblood. It's very strange.
Yeah, it's really weird. And like, and again, the other thing this like does too, aside from making you feel horrible, is go back to kind of what I was mentioning. And like, again, I think Yatsu being the most interesting thing about this is like making you ask, who is it that gets access to the mechanics of redemption?
Yeah,
Like, who can be redeemed? What is the threshold at which someone cannot be redeemed? Is that a final thing? Like, and what are the factors that would either enable someone to do that or not? Because like in the same DLC, like as we transition from Stormblood to Endwalker, is we get the return of Gaius van Belsar,
oh yeah,
who is his name sounds like Caesar's for a reason. He's a conquering general on behalf of the Garleans, and he's kind of this I guess righteous neoliberal like but fascist enabler, where he's like the one person he's the one guy in the colonizing imperium who is genuinely not racist and believes in meritocracy. He is just incapable of conceiving of that the empire itself is racist until like right now.
he's the true believer fascist.
Yeah, it's very strange. And we get this pivot of him like showing up where it's like, oh, you don't trust him, whatever, whatever. But the degree to which he's basically immediately allowed to be a good guy and have never again have the consequences of his action very rigorously examined is immediate.
It's very sudden, and it definitely kind of rankles. And there's a lot of that. There's Gaius. There's like Lolorito. Even again, we brought up the pimp, who is essentially societally forgiven because he's useful. And Yotsuyu is not useful. She is, to her society, she is a burden and a symbol of everything they hate.
Well, yeah, because she was an oppressor and then she was deposed, and then what you have left after that is this amnesiac girl with no skills, no connections, and a mountain of like, social guilt. And like even caring for her, even being someone who takes care of her and look after is something that is like a burden, because you can't just be like, passively taking care of someone and like without have the kindness of your heart. You're also dealing with the fact that you are harboring someone who is definitionally a war criminal
Yeah,
and
no,
feeding and clothing and putting a roof over the head of someone who resulted in the death of countless thousands of people.
yeah, and we're talking about war criminals, but at the same time, in fictional stories, the question of who is and is not deserving of forgiveness is different than it is in real life. And I think,
Yeah, and and again, like, sorry to interrupt, but like, and I only drive this home to remind you that the narrative of FF14 seems to believe that it would be nice if Yotsuyu could be redeemed, but ultimately she is the way she is, and it is out of reach for her.
yeah,
And then Gaius van Belsar, and then later Emmett Selk are kind of have the red carpet rolled out for them, despite very doubtlessly being officiators of legacies of like much longer and more bloody reigns of violence.
well, let me try and finish up then by talking about something who's very, very similar, like why I think this is the case for Yotsuyu.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is probably the most important thing, because we're talking about like these other comparison points, but we're not talking about the most direct comparison point, which is of course Ferdola on the other side of this
That's right.
conflict, who is in many ways the exact same as Yotsuyu. She was abused by her people. She was a traitor who worked for the colonizers. She was defeated by you and imprisoned, and people were chanting for her death. And she is ultimately redeemed. And I think the reason that it works for Fordola and not for Yotsuyu is ultimately that Fordola found something she wanted to live for. She had people who would support her, and she was able to like reach out to those people. She really reached out and involved to others who were willing to give her a chance. With Yotsuyu, she had people who were reaching out for her, but she also had people who were specifically trying to drag her down. And very specifically, she found when she looked inside herself and found she could not try and find redemption for herself. She could not bear to live.
No.
I think that is to an extent that is her choice. I think there are a many contexts in which that choice is made, but I don't think 14 is saying that she is simply uniquely bad. I think it is saying that she could not for whatever reason make that jump, and others could.
Yeah, she did not. She had a lot working against her and not a lot working for her. Like
Yeah.
even the things that were working for her had counterbalances.
Yeah, and it's really sad. And
Yeah.
you want to imagine a better future was possible. I think one was, but even if you can't reach for it, I don't think a hand needs to be extended out, I guess.
Yeah, you can't. You literally cannot pull yourself up by your own bootstraps.
Yes.
There is a requirement, and I think you are right. I think there is a requirement for that process to work because, like, redemption is kind of like itself. Like, it isn't necessarily a personal spiritual thing, right? It is very largely a social thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of proving to the world that despite your, transgressions or missteps or misgivings, that you can in fact still be trusted to exist alongside other people and do what you need to do.
Yeah.
And for Fordola, she did have the benefit of, having a useful trait in the form of having artificial echo so she could go fight primals.
Yeah, that helped. Actually, that is probably the main thing I had not considered before now, that she had a function that she could serve within society.
Exactly. And having that function meant that people who were in positions of power, like, like Raban, were willing to stake it on giving her a chance because, like, the potential gain was worth the risk of, turning her loose, as it were.
Yeah.
But for Yotsuyu, who doesn't have those kind of use and who had like too many counterbalancing forces to have that kind of, network, that she, even if she had reached out to try and like grab a foothold in life and make something new and quote unquote achieve redemption, as it were, there wasn't any ground for her to put her feet on.
Yeah. She had Gosetsu, but that's just not enough in that context. It's
Yeah,
not
no,
enough.
and like Gosetsu's one guy against an entire country that is trying to either one country that is trying to have her head on a pike and the other country that is trying to turn her into a evil ghost.
Yeah. So it was just the context and circumstances were different. It's very unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, I think that about does it, unless you had any last remarks you want to get in for our special FF14 Gorge continuation.
Yeah, all I really have to say, on Yotsuyu, if you're going to support women's rights, you also have to support women's wrongs.
That's right. I will also say on Yotsuyu, I think if you're a cute girl, you're allowed one free murder.
As a treat.
As a treat. Anyway, with all that said and done, I hope you'll join us next time on The Gorge, and it's been wonderful talking to you, Shia.
Thank you for having me, Saturn.
Mm-hmm. The podcast is ending soon. There's no punchline, no grand finale. It's simply ending because it has to, eventually. There's not much else for me to say, but since you've indulged me so far, I hope you'll permit me to take just a little more of your time. It's understood, in modernity at least, that people have free will. We are intelligent beings with the ability to make decisions and act on them. This is as opposed to older philosophies that dictate our fates are preordained by God. I don't personally believe in God. But I don't believe in free will either. We're intelligent beings who can choose, sure, but we're limited by our capabilities, knowledge, instincts, and imagination. There's never an infinite number of choices. We'll always do the things that make sense to us at the moment. If you rewound time to the moment you were born, keeping no insight, no memories, you'd live your second life exactly the way you lived your first. You'd be subjected to the same trials and experience the same joys. It's not because you failed to express your free will differently, it's just because you made the decisions you would have made the first time. The game board being what it is. The pieces being what they are. The rules being the rules. There's only so many ways these things can be configured. Our possibilities are limited. The beginning and end of the game are outside of our power to change. All things are always becoming something else. All things are ending. All things are dying. In the tarot tradition, death represents metamorphosis. From a certain perspective, this tracks. When one dies, they don't just blip out of existence. They leave behind flesh, which decomposes. The memories others have of them, which decompose in their own way. And their soul, or whatever intangible spiritual aspect they possess, which does something we cannot know. All of us are slowly becoming new people. All of ourselves replace themselves. Our interests shift, our roles change. The you of next year will be different. The you of next day will be different, oh so marginally. This moment will not last forever. It cannot. This moment would not exist if even one moment before it had decided to become eternal. Love, friends, innocence, joy, these things come and go. They transform into hatred and pain, loneliness and sorrow, dull silence and cold regret. Eventually, they transform again into love or friends or joy, but different than what was there before. Not the same feelings, never the same. And when those old sensations leave, they never come back. New ones might remind you of the old, maybe better, maybe worse, but even the most familiar stranger is a stranger all the same. I am a formless witch. I was not always this. I will not always be this. But metamorphosis is slow and painful. I do not like who I am. I am not proud of where I've come from. I do not like where I am going. I have watched my love and friends and innocence and joy wither away, leaving only rot and dust in their place. To quote a poem, "He who is living is now dead. We who are living are now dying, with little patience." It is a poem that mourns the dead, and mourns those who survive the dead, and mourns what the world has become in the wake of that death. It is a world suffocated by ghosts, memories, and regrets. Dry pain, cold despair. That poem was published in 1922 in the wake of the First World War. The author, T.S. Eliot, lived until 1965. In between those 2 points in time, in 1939, Eliot wrote and published Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, which would go on to serve as the source material for a musical more simply titled Cats. That would later on be adapted into a movie where famed actor Idris Elba prances around as a horrible-looking CGI Catman. Life is communication. Misery is noise. Joy is signal. A man who writes about the end of the world as he knows it might someday also write a fanciful cat story featuring a guy named Skimbleshanks. The truth is that our only choices in life are whether we live or not. Every signal is a way we choose to keep surviving. Things can be better if you let them be. Life can be livable if you let it be. Every signal is a chance to change your life for the better. I leave you with this, because you'll hear it from no one else at this exact moment in time. I love you. You make me real and give me meaning. I am only here right now because you are. This moment will only exist. It only exists now because you allowed it. The signal we share, this signal, is love. I hope one day I can hear you too. Can you hear me?